Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the City Council Planning Committee. Serving on the committee with me is Councilmember April Barker and Councilmember Dan Hamill. We have two items. The first item today is a follow-up discussion of rental barrier issues. Peter?
All right, Peter Raffato, City Attorney's Office. And I'm happy to go about this, whatever is most helpful to the committee, but I can kind of go through the points in the memo. And what I would propose is that as I go through, I'll identify those areas where I think direction would be helpful so that then we can come forward with an ordinance.
Okay, sure, go ahead. And
right.
No objection up here? Go ahead.
Okay, so in follow-up to that July 10th meeting, we talked about certain elements, and these are laid out in table format at page 30 of the packet with an approach that we can see as an option. And starting with the source of income protection, mainly we would want to define that broadly in my looking at other ordinances. And this is also, I want to acknowledge that Mark did a lot of work on this as well. I think the jurisdictions that have done this see that defining source of income broadly, so it includes various retirement programs. In addition to Section 8, maybe veterans assistance is the most helpful. Define it broadly so that there's no discrimination against any of those types of income. An acknowledgement that other screening criteria can still be used. And then the enforcement mechanism, number 4. There is some decision or some direction from council on whether we want to have a private right of action that's consistent with the City of Vancouver approach and or administrative enforcement. So as you may or may not know, I did send an early draft of this memo to the Northwest Justice Project and got some feedback, and I will identify that as I go through here too. The Northwest Justice Project noted that, so here's the pro and the con with the private right of action. The private right of action being the city's not really involved in the enforcement. We make the ordinance, it becomes law, and then a tenant or someone who feels like this has been violated would be able to seek redress in a court. The good thing about that for the city is we don't have a lot of resources to extra resources if this becomes a large enforcement effort. The downside of a private right of action is that Northwest Justice Project noted that some of these folks don't really have the wherewithal to bring a lawsuit. So that isn't, but there could be a group that gets together if there's a particular problem out there and brings a lawsuit that way. And we do have people like the Northwest, groups like the Northwest Justice Project and law advocates that may be able to bring something on behalf of those who feel that this has been violated. But that's a policy decision as to whether that enforcement mechanism would be included. And then we can include kind of the traditional administrative enforcement mechanisms that we have in the city, which I would recommend it not be a misdemeanor. I'd recommend it be a civil infraction if we're going to go that route. The other item that the Northwest Justice Project identified was to also include mobile home lot rentals in this, in addition to what we commonly think of as rental units, multifamily, and other residential. So those are kind of the elements of the source of income protection element of this, and I don't know if you want to talk about those specific items now or wait till the end as to how
Why don't you go through the whole thing, then we'll discuss them.
All right, notice of rent increase. Currently, under the law, if you're on a month-to-month tenancy, you would have to, the landlord would have to provide 30 days notice prior to the rental period. The Vancouver ordinance increased that to 45 days prior written notice. And so that's just a decision for council as to what that time period would be. The Northwest Justice Project commented that they thought it should be longer than that, but didn't give a specific number, I don't believe. And then we're recommending here that enforcement of that be through a code provision that states that any rental agreement in violation would be deemed null and void. And finally, the Vancouver model provided that a landlord and tenant could agree to waive that protection, but there's certain protections in there. For example, I think you'd have to have the tenant seeking the advice of independent counsel and that sort of thing. So, so that's sort of a decision point as well, whether you want that to be something that the landlord and tenant in their relationship, in their contractual relationship, could waive that. The next item is the eviction notice period. Under Washington state law, month-to-month tenancy can be terminated on 20 days prior written notice. The Vancouver ordinance provided extending that to 60 days notice, and the enforcement mechanism for that is to provide an affirmative defense in favor of tenants in the context of an unlawful detainer action if the landlord does not give such notice.
Can you interpret that in English? The
Okay,
last
so
part that you said.
so keep in mind that we're getting into an area where we're regulating the landlord-tenant relationship, and there is the Residential Landlord-Tenant Act, which provides various notice provisions, and that all gets worked out in that relationship if necessary in a court setting, so an unlawful detainer action if the landlord is to proceed to termination of a tenancy and if the tenant were not to agree to that. So if the way this enforcement would occur then, the enforcement of this provision would give that tenant a right to say, no, you didn't give 20 days notice, or I'm sorry, you didn't give 60 days notice, if that's what the ordinance says, and that would give an affirmative defense to the tenant before they get into the court setting or during the court setting to say, no, you have to give me more time. So it's a way of enforcing that. It's not us saying, oh, you didn't give notice, that's a civil infraction. It's the tenant saying that in the context of a court action or in leading up to a court action.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And then finally, there's the potential exceptions to the above provisions, and that would be renting a portion of a single-family dwelling when the owner or persons entitled to possession maintains a permanent residence in the dwelling. That's one possible exception. The exceptions was something I think the committee wanted some ideas on. And the second one, just noting that the city of Vancouver limited the eviction notice period. They picked out that one and said that provision only applies to owners of 5 or more rental dwelling units. That leaves a couple things in terms of voter registration, going back to the table, we didn't really add anything on that. It's the sense that isn't, it's a policy decision, but we kind of stopped short of that because it isn't obvious to us that is the job of a landlord, and to extend that. I mean, we're requiring landlords. It's a heavily regulated line of business anyway, and we didn't see that necessarily as something you want to include in the ordinance. And I don't recall exactly where we left that when we had our committee meeting. I don't know if that was on the list to bring back in an ordinance or not, but I know it was something that was discussed. And then, Rick, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about number 6 on mass displacement of tenants. Again, that was a topic of discussion. I don't think there was direction to come back specifically with an ordinance provision on that either. But.
So there are really two facets to it in terms of ultimately you always have some redevelopment of homes, and folks may be renters on an individual basis or in smaller units get displaced. That's part of a healthy market as things go forward. That's not a significant concern because that's often what happens. However, there is a concern if we had large complexes, for example, that suddenly were transitioning and all the tenants were displaced at one time because there's no absorption then. The closest we've had to that was when we shut down the Aloha Motel. And that was about 20, if I'm not mistaken, individuals who needed to be placed. We brought resources together and we found placement for all of them. ultimately. Came down to 2 or 3, I think, that were difficult to place, but we solved those 2. Similarly, we would probably do that at this point in time. We haven't observed 1970s or 80s complexes coming back in for that kind of redevelopment, largely because of where they're located. They aren't near significant amenity, and they're not ripe for development that way. Should we observe a trend that would change, we would be far more responsive and look to see if we could find some interventions. I did separate out the manufactured home or mobile home parks in a sense. We'll be talking about that later today. And I think that has a different set of factors and responses we should deal with, largely by preventing the redevelopment of most of those properties. And we could talk about that during that item. So I just sort of said that really shouldn't be included in this rental, but should be included in a separate discussion.
Go ahead.
So we did talk about the potential, and I think staff was going to bring back, but we have a very long work plan, looking at those trends. And as we looked at some of the maps that Chris had, it looked like there were some real hot spots if you were to put it together, places where there's a lot of Class C apartments, where there's, that development is from around the 70s or 80s, and now those areas are gentrifying around. We can see that, and we know that that's going to be next, so that we can be prepared, say either, I don't know if it would be with home levy monies or other things, to see if we can actually do a little bit of prediction, so we get a little heads up and we're paying attention to those areas. Is that something that still might come back? Or?
We could talk more about it. The trends we've seen, if you really want to look historically, the trends would largely be like Fairhaven, where there was displacement of existing tenants and a change in tenancy of the nature of the occupants. And they did restore the units and in many ways change their configuration from being fairly affordable to being more market rate units. We can certainly investigate it. Again, we haven't seen significant starts or indication of that at this point, but we certainly can come back and show those areas that potentially could redevelop. Though at this point, the cost of construction is so great that it's just not ripe yet, I guess. Yeah. But you want to see that demonstrated, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's where we had gotten to. But then also within that, if we're thinking about those, and then we're, as we talked about with the school district, of needing some affordable housing options in different areas, subsidized, these might be areas that, as we know that's going to be happening, we could target as a city, making sure that we're incentivizing or figuring out how to make sure that as this turnover happens, we maintain subsidized affordable housing there. And then potentially we could look at other incentives to create affordable housing that's not subsidized. But it's just sometimes they light up, sometimes they don't. I'm assuming it's going to be over in the Roosevelt area. That's my prediction. We'll see if I'm right.
Mark, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to mention that council actually directed me to do some background research on that, and I did do at least the first round of it, looking at the national market, and that is a market where Class B and C properties are being purchased and repurposed and re-rented at higher levels. But I've just looked at, really broad brush at the national level, and clearly there's more talk about that because the new construction market is becoming harder and harder to make a profit in some markets. But I didn't get any indication yet it's moved down to smaller markets yet. So I'll continue with that research and then speak with the planning department and Chris and Rick and see if we see any of that pattern developing, and also if there's any policy responses proactively to try to incentivize people not doing that, if we can come up with something that would work without,
Thank you,
obstructing normal, action in the market just to rehab buildings that are falling down, things like that. So we don't want to disrupt that.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Okay, committee, on page 30, do we want to make any recommendations on the first 3, or the only 3 really for right now? Go ahead, Dan. Yeah.
So I've been personally interested in the source of income discrimination now for it's probably 2 years. Brought this up quite some time ago. So I'm ready to move that item out of committee and recommend that staff develop the language for an ordinance that supports a broad source of income discrimination prevention ordinance. That and I'm not sure, Peter, how that would work in terms of the legalities, in terms of making sure that VASH, so the Veterans Assistance Vouchers, TBRA, tenant-based rental assistance, Section 8, all the whole slew of the types of supports that are provided for low-income and extremely low-income folks, that's included in there. So however that can happen, that would be my hope that we could do that. Number 3, lack of notice prior to eviction process. I guess one concern that I have is if the tenant, looking at it from both the landlord and the tenant side, if the tenant has created a cause for eviction, destroying the property or having some negative impact, I would want to understand how that factors in to number 3. And then, Peter, you also mentioned that you said 5 or more dwelling units was in the Vancouver model. I'd want to understand that a little bit better. And then also the exemption for room rental, which is not uncommon in this community, given that we have a big student population here. So so I have those questions, but I do want to move source of income certainly out of committee into the committee of the whole. And I'm fine with number 2. I would consider 60 days on that.
Well, why don't you go ahead and make the first motion, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, so make the motion for source of income discrimination to be staff to develop language for an ordinance that addresses source of income discrimination. That's my motion.
Okay.
Yeah, I think with that, we talked about the Vancouver, really following that one that says nonprofit. I mean, they had the broadest.
Right.
I think is what we remember, so fashioning similar.
After the Vancouver model.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Do you have that, Marie?
Yes, did you add the 60 days, Dan, to the motion?
No, I'm focused on source of income discrimination at this point.
Go ahead, Peter.
So the 2 questions under source of income discrimination, would you want us to wrap in the mobile home lot on that? And again, that's separate from the discussion that Rick was mentioning, but do you want to wrap that into it? And then in terms of enforcement, private right of action and administrative enforcement, or one or the other? So those are the...
Yes. Yeah, I don't see there being a difference.
All of the above?
All
Okay.
of the above,
Yeah.
if we can do it. Yeah, I'm supportive of that.
Okay, well, why don't we vote on, we'll get that one out of the way,
Okay.
then we'll go from here. All those in favor of the motion to send this to the full council tonight for consideration, will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 3-0.
Okay.
That'll be brought forward tonight.
So I think there's a couple of these others that we could probably round into maybe 3 different motions, but to bring it all together so it's one ordinance that you hopefully will get direction to work on. And so maybe for me not to go through all of them, but let's start with lack of notice prior for rent increase. I'm in agreement that 60 days is more appropriate. 45 days is barely just enough to go out and be getting a letter and your application process, all of that through. So even 60 days is can be tough, but I think if we do 60 there and if we continue with the 60 in the other, it's just there's a 60-day thing and people don't get confused. When was the 45? When was the 60? Let's see. I think with that, we could probably in one motion, if everybody else is interested, the lack of prior notice for eviction. The 60 days is fine with me. I think we had talked about if there's no good cause. And I think that's the important thing to determine. No, if you go right back into state laws of if you've destroyed property, if you've not paid your rent and had your warnings, all of those things, you don't get protected by this. This is for the people that are just going along in their life and somebody's decided, I want to move my son into my rental. I need you to leave in 20 days. So I think we need to be very clear that it's only for if there's no good cause, and what are those? They did a pretty good job, maybe in Vancouver, of identifying what are those things that would be good cause and then non-good cause. So I'm good with that. The one part that I know we missed, we did talk about a lot, and I had sent an email out, and you cover it in source of income protection. Number 2, the ordinance may require that if income screening criteria are used, any source of income in the form of a rent voucher or subsidy must be subtracted from the total of the monthly rent prior to determining whether the income criteria has been met. And I think this gets at where we had our town hall, and we had a woman that came in, and that was her frustration, that she's found somebody that would take her Section 8 voucher, but then whenever they determined her income level, they wouldn't include her voucher in the income, so she therefore never got the apartment. And it was kind of like, well, if that's a federally, if that's a reliable source of income, then why isn't it included? So I want that attached in there. Otherwise, those three things for me, I feel like we've done a pretty darn good job of going through this, getting a lot of different public comment. I really appreciate this committee's work, as well as you, Peter, and everybody else, but kind of a slow diligence to make sure that we've covered a lot. It makes this process a little bit easier. So,
Are you going to make a motion then on this?
yeah, I'll make a
Okay.
motion that we do the lack of notice for prior rent increase. That would be for 60 days if it's more than 10%. Lack of notice prior to eviction, 60 days with no good cause. Oops. And then adding in that number 2, the ordinance may require that if income screening criteria used, any source of income, that you need to, that should be brought into how much are you making so that you qualify for those terms. Does that make sense to you, Peter, if you were to write something up? Marie? Okay.
She's good.
That's my
She's
motion.
got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just for people out in the audience and people watching on television, this will be presented to the council tonight. It's being forwarded to the full city council. There'll be more discussions.
Yep.
This is not,
No.
this isn't final up here. There's only 3 of us up here, so that's, and it may, who knows when we go through it again, but that's the way. So that's your motion. Any discussion on the motion? Dan?
Just want to be clear that this does not supersede any RCW. This falls below in the hierarchy of law. No, I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm ready.
All those in favor of the motion will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, motion carries unanimously.
Just trying to, let me look over real quick before we finish up. Okay.
Okay.
I think, should we discuss kind of how we want to move forward with 5? I think 6, I'm satisfied for mass displacement to continue to have Mark looking at trends, potentially maybe just have that at least on staff's radar, so if they start seeing things turning over, we can have some ability to move forward if we need to. Voter registration, we did come to a consensus that we certainly need to figure out. I didn't, so if we go back to that meeting, I want to say it was really high, that typically the stats were if you rent, you were much higher likely not to vote or register to vote. And then on top of that, if you were transient, moving maybe every year, every 2 years, that number went even broader. So we already know that the stats out there say that people who are renting for whatever reason are less likely to either register or to vote consistently. And what we heard from the tenants union is it's because of all those things that are coming around, and you just maybe forget to do that. You think you did change of address, and you think that actually changes where your ballot's going, and it doesn't often unless you actually make it into the DMV. So I would like some type of education, but I think that the idea of putting it laid in with what we're posting at all the rentals, and then as we develop more rental resources so that people know, is that kind of, do you need direction specifically to continue to work on that, or was it good enough
No,
direction? from our-
we're going to post it as part of the materials we'll be providing.
Okay.
We're going to give, consistent with our rental registration certificate,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to have a number of links and direction for folks for additional information.
Yeah.
We think that's better in some ways because I think a handbook might disappear in
Yeah.
recycling the very first day. But if there is a problem, they know there's a location right in the site to do it. And we'll put voter registration in that too, in terms of directing people where to go.
Yeah.
I agree with that. The landlords are heavily regulated, and the voter registration, to mandate that and try to enforce it, I don't think that's where I want to go. The city, the county, the university, there's the places to educate people on that, and if we have a handbook for that, that's fine. So,
Well,
go ahead.
and I think we made it clear in our ordinance about we're a don't ask community as far as citizenship is concerned. And so I mean, I think if it's posted there and if somebody wants to go and look at it, or if it's one more thing that they're thinking about because it's there, but I think you'll get into some weird things if you have to tell somebody. I mean, one, you can't tell them
No.
they have to register
Yeah.
to vote, but you might get into discussions that we've already said we don't necessarily want to prompt people having to
Yeah.
get into those discussions here in Bellingham. So, so with that, because it's more administrative, you don't need council approval, so.
We've already had a good direction, and we think it's appropriate to prepare information that's just posting, leading folks to all of these sites, and we will just include it with our public information.
Okay? Okay?
I think we're good.
I concur with April that this has been one of the most deliberative committees I've served on in all my years. I've really appreciated this process, and hopefully other committees take a look at this on bigger issues and dive into it like this. So now we'll go to our next discussion. It's information only.
Can I interrupt you?
Oh,
real quick?
sure, go ahead.
Just for.
Oh, I'm sorry, Peter, go ahead.
With respect to exceptions, do you want us to just try to do some thinking at the staff level and propose what may be appropriate exceptions then when it comes
Yeah,
back
we
to
didn't
the
get to that.
consideration of an actual ordinance?
Yeah, I personally, if you're renting, you're renting. And every rental, and I think everybody should have the same rights. And just because you own 1 or 20 doesn't mean that you should necessarily have any different rules to follow by. And in speaking, so I had called Vancouver when this whole process started, and they were in a process much like us. So if you got to think about politically, what can you get through and how are you going to get it through? And I think some of that was in hopes of that there might be a group of people that might not be as upset about it if they didn't feel like they were going to be included in it. And looking back, that was one thing that they might have changed. So I personally would like you to look into it a little bit more, but I think if you're renting, you're renting. And you need to abide by these rules and no exceptions on if you have 4 or 2 or 1 or 100. So that's my feeling on that. But do you have any?
I want to understand from the planning director what exceptions are out there in other communities and why those exceptions are in place.
I think Councilmember Barker touched on it. It was a political decision, in a sense, to try to deal with folks who make it more of a business and less of just having a few holdings that we're renting, with the thought being that the folks who are in the business would understand it, apply it, and it was the vast majority of the market. The folks who were exempt were a much smaller number. So I think it was not a technical decision as much as a political decision of what should the circle include, and they chose that.
Okay? Okay? Okay.
Do we still have as far as, did you want more direction on rooms in a single-family home? That was one of your other questions.
You mean the 2 exceptions, you mean?
Well, the other exception was, are we going to say if you're the primary tenant and you're renting out rooms in your home, this ordinance doesn't apply to you. It's for somebody
Yeah,
who's.
that's a policy decision. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is that you definitely don't want, or at least I haven't heard a motion to suggest that you want an exemption, exception as articulated in number 2. I guess that leaves number 1.
Yeah, that leaves number 1, and I just need more information on that, and it might be something that, I mean, I'd like for it to be out there big enough that when we do a public hearing, I'm assuming we're going to do one, that
Yeah.
people would know to talk to us about that, like how do they feel about that in general? I think that's one where constituents could lead us a little bit better, because this is more specific to a community. Different communities may or may not want to do this, but I don't know if we don't have it as something, they might not know to look at it or talk to us about if they feel like this should be part of, if it's the primary owner renting out rooms, if they should have to abide by this as well. Because I think the community would be the best people to tell us that. Is there a way to go about that because you're going to bring forward an ordinance?
Yeah, I guess the question is, do you want it in or out when it comes back to you in the ordinance?
Because if it's in, then we'll hear about it. But
We'll
if it's
discuss
out,
it.
people won't know to ask about it if they didn't watch this meeting. Shoot. What do you think?
Go ahead.
Well, I think it's one of those complicating factors that's sort of endemic to college communities where you have shared housing, and in some cases the owner can own the property and have tenants to pay the rent, and that's not just for college students, it could be for others as well. I guess that was kind of my question, was to, how do other communities do that? How do they address that issue where it's not as discreet as an owner who's renting out one property or 10 apartment units or whatever. This is more, it's a little more subtle, and I just want to understand that a little bit better as to how other communities are, how they have developed ordinances and how they address that in terms of fairness.
If I could respond then, and going down now to the level of looking within a house and subletting and things of that nature, I think it's extraordinarily complex. I'm not aware of anyone who provides extended protections for sublettees. If they're all on the lease, then they have their responsibilities to the person who's leasing the property. But if it's released by a room basis or with roommates, I think it's, candidly, I think it'd be very difficult for us ever to enforce. And I think the fact pattern would be very hard to discern, since there's often not paper that solidify those kind of arrangements. I think that the public purpose perhaps is greater served by dealing with the broader issues. And that issue is so complex and would warrant such time and have such a, from my opinion, very difficult for us to enforce effectively, because we're dealing with verbal contracts. I would suggest we sort of steer away from that, and I have not seen anyone who's really stepped up to try to find a way of doing it.
Which would mean our motion would be to have the exception that if you are owner occupied and you're choosing to rent out, you are separate from this. Is that correct?
Well, and again,
Is that what you're saying?
not to muddy the water, I thought the question was, if I was a renter and I had other folks who were roommates of mine, are they equally protected when I wish to displace one of them? And that was the issue.
I would think that, yeah, that would hold under this.
So this exemption came out of an ordinance, I believe, I'm not positive, I believe it was Renton, but I'm not sure. So the way this reads is this exception would apply to an owner or a person entitled to possession, which means you're dealing with the owner or the primary lessee who then sublet. So it's both, is how that reads.
I'm almost inclined to, I see what you're saying on, it's going to be in some ways difficult to enforce, but this is all going to be difficult to enforce. We're going to have to really work with our partners out there in the justice system to, hopefully, we've given enough that somebody could take it forward if they needed to. But I think if we have it in there, then people will know to talk to us about it, and we can take it out if people, so if we put this exception in there, but I think we should word it a little bit more clear because it's a little hard to understand, then when we have our testimony, at least it's there and people can say, no, this is something we think you should take out of there, that shouldn't be an exception, or yes, we like that exception and we think you should keep it in there. Mayor Kelly.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I think that April made the point that this is going to be difficult and worthy to do, so we're not worrying about that. I think this should have more discussion before we put it in an ordinance, because we don't know the unintended consequences, and you can always propose it as an amendment. You don't have to do it immediately. I guess many times I've seen where we pass things and we assume that we'll just work that out later on down the road, and it doesn't get worked out because we haven't really thought about all the impacts before we did it. So I think you're doing really good work here, trying to protect people that are renting in our community and making sure that they are all treated equitably. So I guess I would go along with Rick that this is a complication that might unfocus us from the other good things we're doing that we want to implement well.
Don't have the exception. Okay, Rick, is that what Rick is saying?
Yeah.
Okay, I heard different from Rick. I thought you said.
I'm
No,
supporting the
something else.
exception and suggesting that we don't extend those requirements to that.
Okay.
That's
So
clarification.
I'll move that we add the, and that you're going to make the language a little bit more understandable, but renting of a portion of a single-family dwelling when the owner or persons entitled to possession maintain a permanent residence in the dwelling. But I would like to, single-family dwelling is so confusing. Like, is this a duplex? Is this a triplex? So that it's just a dwelling. It's a unit, I would say, is the language we should use. I don't think, is that helpful? Because I think it'll get a little muddy if people are like, well, I own a duplex and that's not a single-family home, so,
Okay,
okay. There's my motion.
okay. Marie, you have the motion? You're so good. Okay, all those in favor of the motion will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed, motion carries 3-0. Okay, well, now we're going to go to,
Uh-oh.
we've got 10 minutes now before we go to comment period, but that's okay. Committee discussion of potential approaches and techniques to provide additional housing choices in Bellingham. Mr. Sepler.
Yes, for today's agenda, we have two quick presentations for you. The first is on manufactured home parks. As the committee members will recall, testimony was provided that there may be risk associated with the current conversion of those units to other uses. We started by saying the first thing to do is get a handle on what the scope of our issue is, and then we'll talk about perhaps when Chris Behe is done, our next steps to evaluate how to proceed.
Yeah, and while he's getting set up, if anybody listening is interested in what the work we've done up to this point, because there's been a lot of meetings on rental concerns, you can go to the City Council's webpage. You can also call Marie or Mark. Their numbers are right there, and they can link you to all of our past discussions. And I would strongly urge anybody that's interested in this to go back and watch those before you're making comment if you have the time and ability.
Okay, again, thank you. Chris Behe from the Planning Department. So I think in our previous sessions, you've seen this map. I think it was included in a previous memo. Just to recap, within the city, there are 10 established mobile home parks, and in the unincorporated urban growth area, we have 3. There are a total of 970 homes within the parks that are located within the city limits, and then an additional 150 in the parks in the urban growth area. You can see the distribution on the map. And then we have, 970 in parks in the city and the UGA, and then we have 150 that are on individual lots that for the most part have been grandfathered in through areas that we've annexed in recent years. And then just a reminder, the BMC allows swapping of mobile homes and manufactured homes within established parks, but within the rest of our single-family zones, they are only allowed if they are on a standard single-family foundation, a permanent foundation. We don't see that happen very often because it's fairly cost prohibitive, not a lot different than building a regular stick-built single-family home. Just as an indicator, we've only had 5 since 2008 that have been permitted. And just a reminder as well, the recently adopted 2016 comprehensive plan, the land capacity analysis, with the exception of the Samish Way Urban Village, Samish Court Mobile Home Park, we did not count redevelopment capacity on any of the other manufactured or mobile home parks within the city or the urban growth area. We knew that was a source of affordable housing, and we left that alone. So it's not included in our development capacity estimates, with the exception of that Samish Way Urban Village. I'm just going to kind of do a quick tour around the city of the mobile home or manufactured home parks. The one that has closed in recent memory was the Baker Creek Mobile Park. There were 22 units there, built in the 1970s. It was about 7 acres, zoned for commercial planned, and that's where the 154-unit Affinity senior housing project was recently built. And that did close in 2009, so it sat empty for a number of years. In the Birchwood neighborhood, there's the Maplewood Park, which has 9 units in it, built in the mid-1970s on about 3/4 of an acre, and it's zoned residential multi-planned. You can see it kind of right there tucked in between some other multifamily projects. Bakerview Mobile Estates, this is just west of Bellis Fair Mall. There are 140 units there. This was built in the late 70s and the early 80s on 18.7 acres. Zoning is residential single, 6,000 square feet, which is just about the density that's on that property today. James Street Estates in the King Mountain neighborhood, 94 units. This is the only park within the city that has owner occupancy. So these are condominiumized by the county assessor, and so the tenants own the individual small lots that they're on as well as the units. And based on the owner address information we have, this is more than 90% owner occupied. Just south of Bloedel Donovan, we have Millville Park with 134 units built in the mid-70s on 25 acres. And this is residential multi-planned without any, the density is discretionary. Up by Lake Padden, there's the Cresthaven Park with 34 units built in early 1950s on about 3 acres. And this is a residential single with 20,000 square foot zoning. Under that density, you wouldn't get anywhere near 34 units on this property if it were to redevelop. Lakeway Mobile Estates, just south of Whole Foods on Lakeway, 218 units built in the late 60s on 25 acres. And again, this is another planned zone without any specified density. Samish Court, this is the one we had talked about. It's in the Samish Way Urban Village. It's partially within a commercial transition zone and partially within a residential transition zone, allowing 2.5 to 3.5 for the floor area ratio. And this could be somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 to 250 units if it were to redevelop, depending on the configuration. South End Mobile Estates, just north of Old Fairhaven Parkway, built in the late 50s with 84 units on 10 acres. Residential single is the zoning, 75 square foot density. And then just south of that, on the other side of the parkway, is Parkway Village with 103 units built in the mid-80s on about 16 acres. And this is residential multi-planned. And at the north end of Chuckanut Drive, we have Robin Lane, 53 units built in the late 60s on 8 acres. Residential single is the zoning on a 7,200 square foot density. And then moving out to the urban growth area, the All Seasons Park. This is on the north end of Britton Road, built in the 1940s, and then another few units added in the mid-70s, 7 units on 9 acres. This is in the Lake Whatcom watershed and was downzoned a number of years ago to 1 unit per 5. So you wouldn't be able to get any additional units on this. In fact, you'd only be able to get 1 unit if it were vacant land today. And then in the U Street urban growth area, we have the Forest Park mobile home park with 53 units built in the late 60s on 21 acres. The zoning is the urban residential mixed at 6 to 12 units per acre, allowing up to 25% multifamily. And then just a little bit further south is the Hilltop Haven, again in that same urban growth area, with similar zoning for the portion on the east side of the road, 6 to 12 units per acre. And on the west side of the road, it's in the 1 unit per 10 acre zone. It's just outside the urban growth area, and it's an urban growth area reserve, which again was downzoned as kind of a holding pattern. So it gives you a quick tour of the zoning, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
I just have one question. If you own a mobile home there, can you get rid of that and put a manufactured home in a mobile home park or not? Do you know?
I think you can.
I believe so, and I believe some of the ones within the James Street Estates are on a, I don't know exactly what the term is for the foundation, but it's more permanent foundation than the piers with skirting kind of things that you see on some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize until you see the films how many units we do have. That's quite a few units.
One other just side note, the total 970 units represents between 2 and 3% of our overall housing supply in the city. It represents about 14% of our affordable housing supply, just as a statistic.
So I'll pick up where Chris left off, and we've heard testimony and comment from members of the community expressing concern about potential redevelopment of the properties. In the most part, other than the Samish Way property, which we envision changing because of its unique location, the city is supportive of the maintenance of the balance of the parks for their intended use. They provide affordable ownership and rentals, and they meet a significant need as just described. When we go to look at interventions that are necessary to preserve those uses, we measure the interest that's been shown to date for redevelopment, which has been very limited based on review of our records. What we'd probably do at this point is we would add a consideration of alteration of our zoning to provide perhaps greater certainty into the future to our work program. That's a project that we'd wish to undertake because of the public purpose served. We'll monitor the situation in terms of pending development, and if warrants do arise, if an issue comes to our attention, we can respond fairly quickly. But we could imagine within the next year's time considerations, perhaps coupled with some other modifications to our zoning, that could clarify future uses. Again, public purpose is to maintain the use we have because it meets our ends.
Okay. Dan and April.
That's great to hear, and that's really what I wanted. When the Baker Creek facility closed, we had people displaced, and that sat vacant, I think largely because of the recession until 2016 when the Affinity project went in. Mm-hmm. So I just want to be clear. I want the city to be poised and ready to be able to come in and assist those folks that are living in a mobile home park. Should it be warranted? It's just my observation that those folks they're uniquely positioned to be really unleveraged when it comes to being able to find other housing options in a way that others are just not. So I want to make sure that those in most cases seniors have some level of assurance that the city is considering and is ready to move in some capacity, and that's all I'm asking for.
Okay, April.
So, and we just made it, we get one opportunity to kind of change up our comprehensive plan every year, and so we kind of pile everything into one meeting and make sure we get it all there. Are you feeling like we would have the time, and then it's lining up with some other things that we could actually do this, get it into next year's?
Yeah, I'm thinking it'd be on
update,
April's
so we don't
amendments.
have to wait until 2019.
I think our policy base is fairly supportive. We just want to be explicit, and I think that the implementing regs can be revised subsequent to that. So typically we have an April deadline for our comp plan amendments for the year. We anticipate having a few, not many, because we recently adopted the comp plan. This would be something we consider bringing forward at that time.
Okay.
Potentially by next year.
April, it'll be
Yeah.
in April.
It'll
How's
be
that
in
sound?
April.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. We will now go to the comment period. Oh, Rick, sorry.
We do have one more
Oh, I'm sorry.
quick one,
Oh,
not to
SROs.
curtail
Oh, okay,
comment.
sure, go ahead.
But,
Yes, that's,
You had asked about single room occupancy. It's a form of housing that many housing advocates advocate for because it provides for folks who are working but need a very great affordability to have a place. We've asked Lindsay Kirshner to take a quick look at our code, and she can give you an update on what's allowed and where.
Lindsay Kirshner, Planning. So the city codes don't spell out single room occupancy in particular. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and boarding and rooming houses, which our code does address, and then the zoning and where boarding and rooming houses are allowed. So HUD defines single room occupancy as a unit that provides living and sleeping space for use of the occupant, but requires the occupant to share sanitary and or food preparation facilities. So that might be a bedroom that has a small kitchen in it, and then on one floor with a bunch of bedrooms, and then they share a kitchen, or vice versa, where each of the unit has their own bathroom, and then they share common cooking facilities. Our code has something similar, which is a boarding and rooming house. And Those are for persons other than those under the family definition. And typically what we've seen in Bellingham are traditionally built single-family homes that have been converted to boarding and rooming houses, where there's one kitchen and then a bunch of bedrooms that are rented out individually. So these are, boarding and rooming houses are outright permitted in most of the commercial areas of the downtown urban village, Fairhaven urban village, Samish Way urban village, as well as our commercial and residential planned zones of the city. So a large portion of the city outright permits boarding and rooming houses. Where we have seen most of them, and we haven't had permits probably since the mid-70s, 80s for boarding and rooming houses specifically, and most of those were around Western's campus. And for the ones that we do have, they had to apply for conditional use permits through the hearing examiner. And so boarding and rooming houses are conditionally approvable in residential multi-zones, as well as in some of our residential transition zones in the Fountain District Urban Village, Downtown Urban Village, and Fairhaven. So overall, these are the areas where boarding and rooming houses are either outright permitted or conditionally allowed. I can answer any
Thank you,
questions.
Lindsay. Any questions? Okay.
If I
Go
might, just
ahead.
a quick summary. So we do allow them.
Yep.
They would meet a need. One would question why the market's not providing them. A lot is because of our supposition on this, or guess, is because there are other products that are more readily accessible in the market at this point, and that we might want to consider at some future time, at some future levy, for example, directing this kind of project or seeking a NOFA for this specific use, since it would meet workforce housing. But we'd have to be very clear about what we're going after.
Okay. We will now go to comment. If anybody wants to make a comment, come on down. Please disregard the noise in the computer area. It sounds like it's going to take off at any minute, but it won't. 3, 2. 2's good enough. Yeah, we got to move on. There we go.
You gotta talk quick,
My
Ray.
own timer.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, my name's Rick Flug, and I'm very appreciative of your attention to the mobile home, manufactured home
Get
issues.
closer to the microphone. There you go.
Yep, and I wish I'd grown up in a family that makes decisions like you do. That's great, at least in this committee. I just wanted to say by example what the benefit is to me of living in a mobile home in one of the tidier examples that you showed on the map. I've lived in Bellingham 14 years. 10 of those years was in a large home in Birchwood, big yard, intensive gardening, lots of work. One gets older, it gets harder, but I'm a middle earner, and so about 30% of my income was devoted to maintaining and operating that home and enjoying that lifestyle. When I retired, after working 45 full years, my income dropped to about 40% to 45% of that level, and so the housing cost to me went up to about 60%. It just really was not sustainable. I looked for alternatives in Bellingham with my partner of 40 years, and we found a single-wide 37-year-old trailer in a very nice mobile home park, South End. My neighbors, some of them are here. That home cost 10% of what we sold our Birchwood house for, and the overall cost for the two of us in a two-bedroom home, 750 square feet on a half-sized lot, like living in an ADU basically, is $850 a month for everything, taxes, insurance, utilities, lot rent. So now my living costs are back down to about 30% of my fixed income. And the unexpected side benefit of this is I can remain a participant in the local economy. We added an insulated roof to this old trailer with a membrane on it, local roofer, local insulator. I go to Kulshan and other brew pubs, And I really enjoy a great retirement life because I'm able to spend just 30% on this level of housing. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, sir. Next.
Good morning. My name is Ishbel Dickens, and I'm here on behalf of the Association of Manufactured Homeowners. If you don't mind, I first want to go back to the earlier ordinance where you were talking about the manufactured and home and renters' rights. And there's a reason that the state law keeps them separate, and so I just want to make sure that you're very conscious of that. Manufactured homeowners already have just cause eviction. They already have 90 days before their notice, before their rents can be raised, and they can only be raised once a year. So I'd encourage you to make sure you don't conflate those two when you discuss them this evening. And then there's another question came up about whether you could replace a mobile home with a manufactured home. And at this point, that's really just semantics. A mobile home is any home built prior to the HUD Code of 15th June 1976. A manufactured home is a home built when HUD Code went into effect at that time. So one or other, they're both the same in my mind. And then to get to the issue of mass displacement, I'm concerned that doing nothing will not be good enough, given the growth that's anticipated. One community actually in the county just got a notice that their community is for sale last month. So I know that you've got an opportunity when your comp plan amendment process begins in early 2018. I encourage you to take advantage of that, but if there's any way you can have a moratorium in the meantime, because you can't respond. Every single homeowner, manufactured homeowner in the city could get a 12-month notice of closure tomorrow, and there's nothing currently on your books that would prevent them all from being displaced. So anything you can do to stop that vesting period, because as soon as that permit comes in for development, you're stuck. So I really encourage a moratorium while you work through this process and get the amendment in place. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, thank you all for coming. Any closing comments?
I just so that we're not confusing, we are only including mobile homes in that source of income discrimination, so that they'll still have their own rules apply, but, okay.
Anything else? Again, thanks to the committee, thanks to the staff, thanks to the citizens, and this meeting is adjourned.